Good evening, everyone. I'm Yael Hungerford, Executive Director of the Adam Smith Society, and I'm delighted to be welcoming you all here to tonight's event on the new book of inflation, both our members here in the room with us and our audience joining us online. The Adam Smith Society is a community that joins together to discuss and debate the contributions of the free market to advancing human flourishing and opportunity for all. The struggles associated with high inflation drive home the connection between economic prosperity and human flourishing. As we can all personally relate, with inflation at over 8%, the diminished purchasing power of the dollar is a major challenge of our day. We are grateful to be joined this evening by an illustrious group of speakers who can explain to us how we got here and what we can do about it. Joining us tonight are the authors of Inflation, Steve Forbes, Nathan Lewis, and Elizabeth Ames. Steve Forbes is chairman of Forbes Media and the host of the acclaimed webcast, What's Ahead? He's the author and co-author of several books, including Money, the best-selling How Capitalism Will Save Us, and Flat Tax Revolution. He campaigned for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1996 and 2000. Nathan Lewis is a prolific writer on monetary policy and economic history. He's the author of The Magic Formula, The Timeless Secret to Monetary Polarists, and Gold, the Final Standard. A Discovery Institute fellow, his writing has appeared in Forbes, the Financial Times, and elsewhere. He publishes the monthly investment newsletter, The Polarist Letter, and NewWorldEconomics.com. Elizabeth Ames is also a prolific writer. She's collaborated with Steve Forbes on several books, including Money. Her articles have appeared on FoxNews.com, The Daily Caller, The American Spectator, and other outlets. She's a co-producer and writer of the award-winning public television documentary In Money We Trust, which she also worked on with Mr. Forbes. Moderating tonight's event will be the economist Allison Schrager, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and City Journal contributing editor, and Bloomberg opinion columnist. She's the author of An Economist Walks into a Brothel and co-founder of Life Cycle Finance Partners, a risk advisory firm. Before we get started, a brief word on the format for the evening. Mr. Forbes will start us off with a brief overview of the book, after which point Allison will lead the authors in conversation. We will then open up the floor to questions from the audience. Please note this event is being live streamed on the internet. With that, it's my honor to welcome Steve Forbes to the podium.
Thank you. They never predict the weather. They can never predict inflation or the economy. But it is a pleasure to be here, especially with Adam Smith and the Manhattan Institute. Adam Smith is a man revered in name, but very few people actually understood what he was about. Thankfully, you do. And that's one of the reasons why we wrote this book. We started a little over a year ago when, to us at least, it became apparent that the authorities did not know what they were doing on the inflation front and that troubles were coming. It was not genius. It was just looking at what people were doing and not doing. So we decided to do a reader-friendly book, jargon-free, that would explain, one, what inflation is. We all think inflation, higher prices, but there's more to it than that. We also wanted to get to what you do, why it is actually bad. It's not just bad because of raising prices, but also what Adam Smith would have understood. It also tears at the fabric of society. We all know with hyperinflations like Germany had in the early 1920s, the consequences of it. There was a great book by Adam Ferguson called When Money Dies. And he talks about how Germany, before this hyperinflation, was probably the most law-abiding nation on earth domestically. But after that hyperinflation, everything went by the boards. You couldn't survive obeying the rules and being virtuous. And so it corrupted society, destroyed the social fabric, and made possible, not inevitably, made possible the rise of Adolf Hitler, especially combined with the Depression. What we're experiencing now is a slow motion version of what happened in Germany in the 1920s, as we explain in the book. It's not the dramatic situation you have with a hyperinflation like you see with, say, a country like Venezuela today, but it is corrosive over time. And Keynes was right when he said that not one in a million understands what is going on. So we wanted to explain in terms of why inflation is bad. It's beyond just mere so-called economics. It gets to the whole social fabric, because how is it that we deal with one another? If we have a trustworthy money, I don't have to know anyone in this room, but we can do sophisticated transactions together, put supply chains together, and cooperate together and make it work. When the money's untrustworthy, we cease to trust other people. People always say capitalism is inhuman. No, capitalism is actually very human in the sense that you may not love your neighbor, but you always want to sell to your neighbor. So you try to figure out, how do I appeal to you? How do I make you part with your resources to buy what I'm offering? So in that sense, it has us interact in ways that people don't realize, but commerce brings people together in ways that we really don't fully understand or appreciate. So inflation undermines that. And so you get the kind of situation today, scapegoating. In Roman times, when they had inflation, they'd blame the Christians, good for the lions, but not too good for conquering inflation. Inflation destroyed Rome, along with excessive taxation, more than the barbarians. Medieval times, it was the witches who were the evil people who caused inflation. The early 20s, with the hyperinflation in Germany, it was Jewish merchants and bankers. In the 1970s, Richard Nixon blamed greedy Arabs. And today, the scapegoating goes to meat producers, oil company executives. Vladimir Putin, bad guy, but you can't blame him for a lot of the stuff, the self-inflicted wounds we're doing to ourselves. And so that pattern repeats itself. Then what to do about it? It's amazingly simple how to conquer inflation when you know what you're doing. I'll get to that in a second. The thing to get your mind around inflation is understand, and there's a lot of confusion on this, there are two kinds of inflation: monetary inflation and non-monetary inflation. Non-monetary inflation, you say you have a drought that sends up crop prices. So prices go up. But normally that will work its way out and prices will level off. Or you have shutdowns like we had with the pandemic, where you shut down the global economy, disrupt global supply chains in a way that the experts didn't understand the extent of damage that it did. So you have shortages and you have high prices. But again, if the government would let it happen, we'd eventually work our way out. A good example is what happened after World War II. During World War II, the economy geared to being a wartime economy. No cars were manufactured, refrigerators weren't manufactured, everything was rationed. The war ends, price controls were done away with, rationing was done away with. So for a couple of years, the big issue was the high cost of the rising cost of living. It was a big issue. Well, you don't make a transition from making tanks to refrigerators overnight, but eventually it worked its way out. And the amazing thing after World War II was that we had 10 million veterans returning to the workforce. And because we did things largely right, unemployment never went above 5%. Remarkable achievement. Today would be like bringing 20, 25 million people, dumping them in the workforce and having low unemployment. Amazing. So in terms of the non-monetary inflation, unfortunately, this government is continuing to put barriers in the way of getting rid of non-monetary inflation, waging war against energy and the like, war against railroads, whatever it is on their target list they go after, which hurts commerce. And so instead of increasing supply, they decrease supply. Now, monetary inflation is actually more invidious. As I mentioned with non-monetary, if you leave things alone, people will sort the thing out fairly quickly. But non-monetary, as indicated, it hurts the fabric of society because it really destroys trust between people. As Keynes said, nobody understands the process. Imagine for a moment the Federal Reserve was in charge of the Time Bureau. God forbid. But let's say they come up with a scheme. We can increase productivity if we add 30 seconds to the hour each day or month or whatever period of time. And so that way, gradually people will be working longer for the same pay. By golly, that would increase productivity, which would be good for the economy. Well, after a while, people would notice we seem to be working longer and we don't understand what's going on. Well, that's what happens when you play with the value of money. Inflation is reducing the value of a currency, usually from cash-strapped governments looking for a quick way to pay bills, but also the idea of, you see at the Federal Reserve, who actually thinks that you can have a 2% inflation, put aside how you measure these things, and that is how you generate more optimal growth. And one of the things about the Federal Reserve, we touch on in the book, It is absolutely preposterous that a group of central bankers can actually positively and constructively guide an economy of 330 million people here and 7 billion people around the world. If just in this country, people do billions of transactions each day, what to buy, what to sell, maybe not buy, not to sell. And a handful of people, even if they're geniuses in Washington, can guide that is preposterous. The best thing the Fed would do is focus on keeping a stable value of the money. Now, people say, what is money? Money is like a claim check. You know, you go to a restaurant, you check your coat. What do you get in return? Piece of paper, piece of plastic. Worthless in and of itself, but a claim on a real product. You buy a ticket to an event. Whether it's an ellipse on your handheld or a piece of paper, worthless in and of itself, but a claim on a real event, a real product, a real service. And so money is like claim checks. You get the claim checks and you go in the marketplace and get things that you want, so you don't have to do barter or anything else. So it makes an economy work. And the problem with inflation is it's like a virus in a computer. It corrupts the information. Prices tell us what's dear, what's not dear. We do it billions of times a day. But when a price goes up, you figure something must become more valuable. People want more of it. Well, inflation, what happens, a good example, was in the 1970s. Oil went from $3 a barrel to almost $40 a barrel. Was that because we're running out of oil? A lot of people thought so. Was oil more valuable? No. Turns out the dollar was weak, not oil becoming more valuable. It corrupted what the price was telling you about the real value of oil. In the early 80s, when we conquered that terrible inflation, oil crashed down to $10, $12 a barrel, finally settled at $20, $25. In the early 2000s, we're at it again, debasing the dollar. Oil went to $100 a barrel, copper went up, wheat went up, housing went up, and we all saw where that led. So it corrupts the information that prices give to an economy. So in terms of what we do about it is now this gets very controversial, and I'm sorry this is being recorded, but this is dangerous. You want cancel culture? Just go among a lot of people, policymakers, economists, politicos, and mention GOLD. It's like waving a cross in front of a vampire. They. But the fact of the matter is, for a variety of reasons, the gold standard worked. It never led to an inflation. And the myths around it are legion. We can discuss it in the Q&A. But if you want stable prices, not stable prices, you want stable money in value for a variety of reasons. Gold keeps its value better than anything else. Alexander Hamilton was right in the 1790s. We were on it for 180 years, went through Civil War, Depression, World Wars. We still had the highest rates of economic growth in human history. Obviously, there are other factors, but even if you get the money right, the regulations right, the taxes right, if you don't get the money right, you're not going to have optimal growth. Because when people invest in the future, they implicitly assume that what they're going to get back are pieces of those claim checks that were the same when they made the investment. It encourages long-term investment and trust. When that goes down, you get less productive investment. So in closing, since that is absolutely impossible to do a gold standard, which is very easy, gold is like a measuring rod, like a ruler, like a scale. Since that is just beyond the pale, we can do what we did in the late 80s through the late 90s. Alan Greenspan, who was then the head of the Fed, was actually an aficionado of the gold standard. And he publicly said he was keeping the dollar sort of in line with the price of gold. Not perfect, sloppy gold standard, whatever you want to call it, but it worked. Then he lost sight of, he took seriously that he was a maestro, lost sight of what the gold was telling him. And first we had a deflation and then a terrible inflation that led to the crisis of 2008. So in polite company, you can say, let's do what the Fed did in the 80s and 90s, late 80s or late 90s. But in the meantime, keep in mind, unfortunately today, the Federal Reserve does not focus on keeping the stable money value. When you buy a gallon of gasoline, you assume the amount is the same. It doesn't change each day. When you buy a pound of cheese, you get 16 ounces of cheese. That doesn't fluctuate each day. So too, we all know, fixed weights and measures make markets work best. Same with money. Money measures value. When that fluctuates, bad things happen. So in terms of what to do, we should say, let's do what the Fed did in the past, because right now the Fed has the belief that inflation is caused by people wanting too much stuff. So they want to depress the economy. They want to slow it down. And when they say soft landing, that's Fed speak for perhaps a recession. As they think you got to slow the economy down to conquer inflation. No, you don't. You fix the integral value of the dollar. The government stops trashing the economy. It would be amazing how things would quickly come back. So that's why we wrote the book, to explain what it is: non-monetary inflation, monetary inflation, examples of the past of governments mucking things up, but also occasionally governments get things right. As Nathan has pointed out, 2 examples, and then we'll get to the discussion. After World War II, Germany and Japan had hyperinflations. Then they fixed their currencies, the yen and the new Deutschmark, to the dollar, which was then fixed to gold. And by golly, those economies grew at blistering rates. Japan achieved high growth rates even after it recovered from the war in terms of production, had growth rates exceeding even what China did in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. So stable money, not the be all, but it's an absolute necessity. So if you want prosperity, stable money, low tax rates, sensible rules, and miracles happen because people are out there trying to make it happen from areas that we don't even know about, like Steve Jobs. Whoever thought a guy abandoned by his biological parents would rise up to be the dominant person in business. That's what happens in free markets. And free markets, as Schumpeter would point out, are always in a state of flux. That's another word we should get rid of: equilibrium. No, markets are always in turmoil, positive turmoil, we hope. But with that, again, thank you very much for coming. We do hope you enjoy the book and the oncoming discussion. And we have a great, actually sensible economist here. There are some. And we've got Elizabeth and Nathan. And by the way, I have to brag on Nathan a little bit. He does a lot of research. And when he was years ago, was doing research in the Bank of England and what the Bank of England was doing in the 1800s. And he noticed that Bank of England had never updated their records in the sense of either typing them up or eventually digitizing them. Thanks to his pressure saying, why don't you do it? Bank of England has now been digitizing its economic records. So Nathan's not just a researcher, he's a catalyst for scholars for progress. So with that, thank you very much for coming.
So thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, then we'll open it up to the audience. And I'm throwing out questions, but either one of you who feels most want to answer, go for it. So congratulations on the new book. So when you look at economic history, it seems like when we were on the gold standard, there was a lot more, business cycles were a lot more severe. We had bigger highs, bigger lows, recessions lasted longer. So if the gold standard would offer more stability, why is that the case?
I'll let Nathan do it too, but I'll start it. First of all, how you measure an economy counts. For example, agriculture was huge in the country in the 1800s. And at the time, the US was bringing tens of millions of new acres to plowing, growing crops. Argentina was rising up. Australia was rising up, growing wheat. Ukraine was growing wheat. And so you had a huge surge of production. Guess what? When you have a lot of production, and especially when you can ship it around the world, prices go down. That was not the gold standard. The US economy, especially on the industrial side, actually expanded during that period of time. And in terms of volatility, when you start a lot of new companies at the same time, you're going to get shakeouts. But the progress was undeniable, which is, and that's why the US did so well from 1775 when this experiment began, when we were largely not subsistence, but an agricultural society, to 1900, when we were many times the size we were in 13 colonies in 1775, and we were the greatest industrial nation in the world. So they overlooked what actually was done and what actually was impacting the economy. Nathan, you know more about this than any of us.
Yeah, so if we look let's talk a little bit about the 19th century history. There's actually some very good discussion about this recently among more academic types, and I'll try to summarize a little bit. A lot of the history of that time in terms of the statistical history was written by some post-war Keynesians who wanted to say why they should have a job in government, why they should run everything, coming out of the Great Depression. So it's, oh yeah, it's not just the Great Depression, all these problems. Well, if there's so many problems, how would we get so rich? We just go out on the street, look at the buildings they used to make
Well, you
in
can
those
have
days.
volatility and growth at the same time. Usually they go hand in hand.
Well, yes. So Christine Romer, the economist, went back and she said, yeah, she kind of, in her opinion, corrected this and found that they were much more mild. And the other issue that has come up and has been widely discussed is that gold has been universal. So if it's gold's fault as a standard of value, you link your currency value to gold, and obviously if gold itself goes up and down in some kind of volatile way, that could create problems. Well, if that happened, it should be apparent through all the economies that were linked to gold, right? Shouldn't Britain and Germany and France and everybody who was linked to gold also have the same problems at the same time? Well, they didn't. So they were US centric, and so it's basically some kind of institutional issue within the US. You know, other aspects of government policy, some kind of subtleties of banking regulation. There was the crisis of 1907, which led to the Federal Reserve. Well, Canada, also on the gold standard, didn't have a crisis. Not gold's fault.
Mhm.
And they knew that, so that's why they created the Federal Reserve, but the Federal Reserve stuck with gold. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the banking institutional framework. So if you look at the history, certainly the last 15 years or so, they looked at it and said, yeah, these were minor problems in a really incredible upward trajectory of growth.
And when you did get a major crisis, like happened in the early 1890s, was in precise response to the agitation of the agricultural sector. They had what historians used to call the Populist Revolt. There was a guy named Hicks who wrote a book on that. We used to read in college back in stores for roaming the earth. And they led to the agitation to just have a silver standard, and which would be the equivalent of a 50% devaluation of the dollar, thinking if we devalue the dollar, the debts would go away, agriculture would be great. And so that kind of uncertainty led to runs on the dollar, led to economic uncertainty. Was the US going to go the way of other countries and be inflationary oriented, or were we going to stick with the Hamiltonian model? And so you got the turmoil in the 1890s.
But wouldn't you have that if you moved to a gold standard? Because I mean, anytime you have a fixed exchange rate regime, there's always a risk of devaluation, at least with the floating.
Well, the devaluations you had after World War II, at the end of World War II, we created a system called Bretton Woods, named after a town in New Hampshire where they all met, the Allies, to figure out what are we going to do after the war. And so the system they devised was that the dollar would be fixed to gold and other currencies would be fixed to the dollar, since they had most of the gold, the dollar. And so when you had a devaluation, it was a big event. It was a crisis. The newspapers wrote about it. Today, you have massive fluctuations in the exchange markets, and nobody says boo. It's considered normal. So fixed exchange rates is like saying a metric meter should be the same in Canada as it should be in the US. You don't have each country having their own different metric system. They're uniform. You want a uniform measurement. And one of the reasons we invented the euro, we didn't, but the Europeans did, was when the dollar left gold and you had these massively floating exchange rates. Europe, which does most of its trade internally in intercontinental trade, said this is intolerable. And so they tried to create stability, and that's why they ultimately created the euro, so they could trade with each other and not have to worry about the volatility in exchange rates, which is a real hindrance on commerce.
Yeah, but I think we're seeing with the euro is that, you have different economies that are in different places and,
Well,
have different credit
and
risks. And
the
it's very
US,
constraining
yeah,
for,
yeah, and in the US, we have different states even doing different economic performances.
yeah, but
compare-
we have a fiscal union. So it's different. Like you don't.
Yeah, but so what?
Mhm.
I mean, the dollar is as good in New York as it is in Texas, even though New York's economy is not nearly as vibrant now as, say, Texas or some other states. So the idea that you must have a uniform fiscal system, no, you can have a state that behaves utterly irresponsibly, but that doesn't mean the value of the money is different. It just means they're wrecking their own economy.
And there are actually about 44 countries that have currencies pegged to the dollar. And we don't care. Go, do what you like. Doesn't matter. We don't demand fiscal, union with the United States, El Salvador or something.
So when I learned monetary policy, I was of the vintage, I guess, that to think that, well, some minor inflation is fine. What's dangerous about inflation is the uncertainty. So if you have predictable inflation, which you can achieve through, and I'm sympathetic to a lot of your criticisms of the Fed. I think they're well deserved. But if you actually do follow rules-based monetary policy, you can have fairly predictable inflation, and it's the uncertainty that matters rather than the level. Sounds like you disagree.
Can I jump in on this?
Yes, please.
So why is it that deducting 2% from your paycheck every year, which is what basically 2% inflation is considered stability by the Fed? So why is it that, where's the moral justification for taking 2% of what our money's worth away every year?
Well, there's value in that. I mean, one, if inflation's predictable, the hope is that your wages would rise with that. So your wages are going up with it. But also, one, it gives the central bank the ability to sort of soften the blow of business cycles. And also, when there is a recession, if you have some inflation, people don't like wage cuts. And when you have a recession, labor becomes less valuable. So if you have some inflation, you can just have it you don't have to actually give people a wage cut. It will just naturally fall as opposed to actually going in and actually cutting wages.
Well, if you look at the last 50 years, so the story of inflation for us now has really is a 50-year story from 1971. And if you look at the cumulative effect of this supposed 2% inflation per year, for putting aside what we're going through now, it's the reason why younger people say, well, I can't afford what my parents could. It's because your money is worth, Nathan will say, the dollar as defined by the value of gold has declined by some 98% since 1971. Isn't that right? Am I right with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And during those 50 years, no one ever said, oh, we like lots of inflation, right? That they always said, oh, we're inflation fighters. Arthur Burns, who blew up the gold standard along with Richard, said he was an inflation fighter, right? They all were. But it just happened along the way. And I think our dollar is actually worth about 2% of what it was worth in those days. And look at the price of oil. It was $30 and $3 in the 60s, and now it's kind of getting close to 150.
I think this gets into what creates growth, not making people poorer and lowering the value of your money. Innovation is the creator of growth. And you're not going to get, if your money is going to be worth 2% or 5% less, 5 years from now, it's going to discourage investment. It's going to create uncertainty, especially if you have a fluctuating currency.
Yeah, when anyone asks me, should I invest in gold? That means we have a problem. You buy gold as an insurance policy, not as an investment that's going to create new software or whatever. And to see what happens over time, and we have this in the book, from after World War II, when Bretton Woods fully kicked in, from the late 40s to the late 60s, our average growth rate per year was 4.2%. When we blew up Bretton Woods, the rate went down to 2.7. Even though we had some good periods, we had some pretty awful periods. Now that doesn't sound like much, 2.7 versus 4.2, but you compound that over 50 years, and the result is devastating. Take household income today. Median household income today is $67,000. If we'd maintained our 200-year average of growth, or even our post-World War II average of growth, that median household income would be $100,000 to $110,000 today. Now, wouldn't people be a lot happier with currency stability and $30,000 to $40,000 more of income? You ask the question, you answer it. Over time, fooling around with the value of money, which is what inflation is, gives you trouble. And volatility. You're always going to get volatility, but that doesn't mean you don't have unemployment insurance. Doesn't mean, in fact, rich countries can afford unemployment insurance. They can afford food programs. They can afford these safety nets more and more. So one doesn't mean if you have a stable currency that everyone is going to be bereft and thrown out in the streets. You're not going to get medical care anymore. Quite the opposite. Governments don't create, central banks don't create resources. People do in a free economy, trading with each other. And this is where thinking about barter may actually be helpful. When you buy and sell something, you're in effect exchanging a product or a service for another product or service or an investment, but you do it through the medium of that claim check rather than doing it with a physical thing. So when the government says, oh, we're creating jobs, no, you're not. The question is, are you creating an environment where people can do businesses, people can expand businesses, people can create new things? And, talking about meeting the needs and wants of others, I think it was Steve Jobs when he was once asked, do you do marketing surveys? He was the creator of Apple. And Jobs said, no marketing surveys, because people don't know what they want until I show them. And he did not lack for self-esteem, but it gets to the heart of an entrepreneur. You're offering a new product or service, and you may think people are going to love it, but there's no guarantee they will, or they'll end up doing it in a way you did not anticipate. And the other thing in a society which gets overlooked is that what they call the learning curve. You're constantly improving things. So it's not enough to say China invented this 1,000 years ago. You have to have an environment where it's constantly being improved, constantly finding new uses for it. Whether it's little things, you go to a coffee house like Starbucks, 12, 16, 20-ounce cups. You notice the lids are all the same size, so you don't have to carry 3 different sizes of lids. Little things like that are constant in the society. Thousands of times a day, people figuring out, even not just big things, but little things to make productivity, make it easier to do commerce, which is why in a free market, shortages always become tomorrow's abundances, if you let it.
So one reason why, or 2 reasons why gold is valuable is it is both in finite supply and it's shiny. And I guess there's some industrial uses. So, so why not move to crypto, which is also in theory in finite supply, not shiny, but finite.
So the most important thing you need for money, what is money? It's basically a human invention. We look for the thing in the world that most resembles what our thing in our mind is that we want. And what we want is something that's stable in value. Keynes called it a stable measuring rod of value. And that idea is kind of gone by the wayside. Now we have, Jay Powell's yesterday's opinion. But the characteristic of gold, which has been proven over centuries, is that it has been reliably stable in value. It
Well, if you look at
money.
gold prices, they're all over the place.
I'll get to that.
Yeah.
I'll get to that. And Bitcoin, whatever its the other characteristics are, it obviously does not have that characteristic. If you just look at all the countries, the 100 national currencies, always the guy with the most volatile currency has the worst economy. He keeps doing Venezuela or something as an example, but even out of those extreme cases, Turkey, the ones with the most volatile currencies have the biggest problems. The ones with the most kind of stable and reliable currencies, like the euro, have the fewest problems. And gold has been proven over centuries of experience to do that. And I want to remind people that the United States did this for almost 2 centuries. In the last decade of the gold standard era, the 1960s, was probably the most prosperous decade of the last century. No one wanted it to end. IMF didn't want it to end. Richard Nixon didn't want it to end. They just kind of dropped the ball. It was a big accident, but it worked great.
People always say that the gold price fluctuates. And what it really means is that the dollar loses, and it's not the price of gold, it's the value of the dollar. So if the value of the dollar declines because they printed too much money, or the demand for the dollar, the value of the dollar has to do with the demand from the economy and the amount that is being printed. Those two things determine the value of the dollar. So when the value of the dollar drops, the price of gold goes up. It's not the price of gold that fluctuates, it's the value of money that fluctuates.
And that gets again to the example of oil in the 70s or in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, oil was $20, $25 a barrel. The Treasury Department started to feel that they should have a graceful devaluation of the dollar because that would improve the balance of trade. Another statistic that should be banned. But so the dollar's value went down and oil prices went up. And you got all the stories, we're running out of natural gas, we're running out of oil, copper went up, everything went up. And people thought, well, we're running out of this stuff. No, we're not. It was the dollar that was weak. So if you think of gold keeping a constant value, not perfect, but better than anything else, when the nominal price of gold goes up, it's the dollar going up and down, the euro going up and down, and people's perceptions. Another thing to keep in mind is people talk about money supply, and they say if you have too much money, you're going to get inflation. Well, that depends if people trust the currency and keep the value of the currency. Nathan has written and others have written that you take the Swiss franc. If you take the Swiss franc and look at the money supply and say, my God, they must have a hyperinflation. There's so many of them. Smallish economy, 8 million people. Look at the amount of money out there. Yet the Swiss franc has maintained its purchasing power better than probably any currency in the world in the last 100 years. So why people want the currency? Why is the supply so high? Because people trust the Swiss will keep it stable in value. And so therefore they want more of it. That's why the Swiss franc, even though it's Switzerland's 1/4 the size of Canada, their money supply is 2 or 3 times that of Canada. Because people trust the franc, they don't trust so much the Canadian dollar. So again, don't just look at the supply, look at whether it does have a history of keeping a stable value.
Yeah, that's a good example of this. We hear, it's too much money chasing too few goods. Excuse me.
It's Powell calling.
Too much money chasing too few goods. Obviously, in the Swiss case, it just obviously blows that thing completely out of the water, right? The reason there's so many Swiss francs are in existence is because they're so popular, and they're so popular because they're so well managed. Just like Tether, stablecoin, it's become very popular. Way more Tethers out there. It's maintained its value.
And by the way, on Bitcoin, they say, well, Bitcoin has limited supply. They don't understand. It's not the supply that counts for the value or the desirability of a currency. It's whether you keep a stable value. So even though Bitcoin has come down recently, if you had 5 years ago done a mortgage in Bitcoin for say equivalent to $250,000, you'd owe the bank $10 million, $20 million today. That's not currency. So if you want to look at cryptos, the future lies with stable coins. Put aside how some have been grossly mismanaged, but if you have true transparency of what the asset is behind a stable coin, the time is going to come, and you start to see it already, it's going to become easier and easier already now to use cryptos to do commercial transactions. The key is if you can create a stable coin or stable coins that you feel you can use for long-term contracts. That's when cryptos challenge the government monopoly on currency. Be very interesting in the next 10 years to see that battle unfold.
Well, let's open this up for questions in the audience. I'm sure there are many.
Do we have a microphone?
I'll let Joe pick.
Sure. I'm John Stone. I'm with Near Earth Capital. And my question is, I saw another speaker recently say that the US's reserve currency status with respect to the rest of the world is a great burden in the sense that it overvalues the dollar and hurts US workers. How does that fit in? And I'll just throw that out to the group. I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Well, the idea that if you have a stable currency that's bad for workers, it's quite the opposite. There is no burden. All it means, how did the dollar become the reserve currency? Because of its historic stability and the openness of the US economy, we became the largest economy in the world. And even today, with all the junk that we pile on this economy, it's still a pretty desirable economy. And so the dollar became desirable because people felt it was semi-trustworthy, at least compared to most other currencies, was of a size that you could use around the world. And that's why in countries like Argentina, they all do most of their transactions using the US dollar. That's why most of our currencies now resides outside of the United States, because people don't trust their local currency. So it's no burden. It's not that we were designated reserve currency. Britain's pound became a reserve currency because of the stability of the pound. It earned it. The Dutch before the Brits achieved the same thing. And if you look at these, take those two countries, how did Holland, the Netherlands, in the 1500s, owned by the Habsburgs, literally underwater? Those who fear the world is coming to an end answer how the Dutch have lived underwater for 500 years and thrived. How did they not only break away from the Spanish Empire, but also, thanks to the deliberate decision to have a stable currency, became the capital center of the world, Amsterdam. The Brits took it another step with King William, import from Holland, and Britain, a second-rate power, eventually became the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and the capital center of the world, London. Alexander Hamilton spent nights, it's an amazing story, during the Revolution, fighting, daily battles. At night, he'd be writing these long essays on how we could achieve, learning the lessons from the Bank of England, currency stability in this new country. And the US eventually became New York, the capital center of the world. So if you get the money right and create trust, by golly, even if you're underwater, even if you're a small island or an agricultural nation trying to get independence, you can become a powerhouse economically. That's the wonderful thing. Any country can do it.
Thank you. Rob Leastone, Forest Capital, from the New York professional chapter. I like the Swiss franc example you guys gave. I was wondering if you can just apply the same framework to Japan or Japanese yen, because when you talk about the demand of Swiss franc, I would assume actually the majority of that demand is not from domestic and not from 8 million people, but from a lot of wealthy folks around the world. But yeah, obviously Japan will be a different case. I mean, yes, Japanese yen is a safe haven currency, but I assume the foreign demand for that currency is a lot smaller versus domestic demand for it. But if you look at Japan, right, I mean, the past 3 decades, there's no inflation, there's deflation. I mean, even right now, the inflation last month for them is like 4%, right? Still, for them is high, but versus the rest of the world, still very low. So just curious your thoughts to that particular currency and country.
I'll say a few remarks about that because I'm familiar with it. The demand characteristics for base money, central bank liabilities, currency in Japan is quite different than elsewhere in the world. They have much higher demand for cash, banknotes for one thing. If you've ever been to Japan, it's very common to pay for a restaurant meal with $600 of cash, just the way it is. And their cash per capita is multiples of what you have in the United States. So there's that. And then the other thing, which is true of Japan, also true of Europe, is the banks are much larger. They don't really have so much of a corporate bond market like we do. The corporations don't finance with bonds as much. So it goes through the banks, and banks, I don't remember the exact statistics, but assets of Japanese banks is like 270% of GDP, and it's 80% of GDP in the United States. So 3+ times larger And the other aspect of base money besides the actual banknotes is bank reserves. And so when you have larger banks, you have greater demand for bank reserves for regulatory purposes. And then on top of that, there's only a characteristic of Japan. It's a pretty closed system. It's a little club of, I don't know how many, 7 major banks and a couple of major life insurers. And you can get the whole group in a room around a conference table. And if the government says, we want you to hold a lot of this money that we're printing, just stuff it in a box and keep it out of the economy, or will make life hard for you, then they can do it. So now, last time I checked, cash at Japanese banks was, I think, 26% of assets, which is totally crazy. There was one moment in U.S. history where, well, a couple moments in U.S. history where they had similar levels just before during early World War II and in the Civil War. So it's not unprecedented, but the combination of very large banks and extremely high cash holdings, possibly with some bureaucratic arm twisting, is my explanation of how they've been able to keep it together. But already, it looks like things are getting kind of shaky. The yen is getting kind of that EM currency crisis look to it. So we'll just have to see how things turn out.
Hi, thanks for the discussion. Very interesting. Steve, it sounds like when you talk about currency stability, you have in mind keeping the absolute value of money or the money supply constant over time. On the other hand, when you talked about a compromise solution to going back to the gold standard, that is going back to Alan Greenspan's monetary policy rules. And
Half-baked gold standard.
Half-baked gold standard, yeah. It sounds like you're willing in that case then to accept a positive rate of inflation because during that time, the inflation rate was positive. So if that's the case, if you're willing to accept a positive rate of inflation, wouldn't it be better to have a constant positive rate of inflation or as close to that as possible? And if so, why would Greenspan's monetary policy be better than, say, Milton Friedman's proposal for a K% rule, where the money supply is grown at a constant fixed rate to keep the price level change constant over time?
Well, with fixed exchange rates, it doesn't mean the money supply stays stable. As Nathan points out, between 1775, when we were a relatively poor nation, agriculture, compared to Britain, to 1900, when we were 50 times larger, the US money supply went up 160-fold, even though the gold supply only went up 3 or 4-fold. In other words, when an economy becomes more prosperous, more money is created. A restaurant gets bigger, it has more claim checks or coat checks and the like. And in terms of Greenspan, the only reason I refer to the late 80s and the 90s, what they called the Great Moderation, was that in polite society, that's the only way you're going to get relative stability. And I underline the word relative. The way you really do it is the way we did it with Bretton Woods. But that gets you to cancel culture. You cannot mention in serious company Bretton Woods as a serious monetary system for the United States or something like that. So to me, it's a political compromise to get to the ideal situation in the short term. What I'm trying to get away from is the idea the only way you can conquer inflation is trashing the economy, which is what the Fed believes right now, rather than having at least a half-baked gold standard. So, and inflation, you can't have a steady rate of inflation. First, how do you measure it? You look at the way they put these price indices together, and you see that it's immensely complicated. Even though today we have about, 15 or 20 different ones that are recognized as having various degrees of validity. They have choke index. I mean, it's nonsense. So, and the other thing too is in terms of measuring inflation, you get what they call velocity. Velocity is the word for how many times people use a dollar bill. If you stuff the money in your mattress, that's zero velocity. It just stays there. Whereas if you spend it, you may pay me for a subscription, and then I go out and buy a Big Mac or something, and so you get velocity. What Friedman didn't recognize was that velocity changes. velocity was relatively stable under the gold standard. When you had floating exchange rates, it went all over the place, which is why when the late 70s, Volcker tried to do the monetarist experiment. And because you couldn't control velocity, the only thing the Fed can control on money is base money, currency, and bank reserves. Once it goes out in the economy, they have no control over velocity. And so the dollar was careening. You look at 1990, 80, 81, dollar was careening all over the place. You couldn't control the velocity. So you can't control inflation, however you define it. And so why go for inflation? Why have a standard where the pound of cheese goes up a half an ounce each year? Just keep the thing stable. You don't adjust the number of inches in a foot. Remember, money is a measure of value.
I want to make it's actually a very good point. And we embrace the principle of maintaining a stable currency value. Well, how do you do that? Well, the traditional method was always to link the currency to gold, and it worked very well. This is actually very common today. People say, "Oh, we don't do that anymore." But actually, more than half of all the countries in the world do this. They don't have floating fiat currencies, at least in principle. They don't have some central banker guy making this stuff up as they go along. They link their currencies to the dollar or the euro. More than 100 countries do this. It's the same basic principle. They use some external standard. They link their currency. And once you do that, the CPI actually becomes irrelevant because you already have a policy, but the CPI is up, CPI is down. It's not really that important. I'll give you an example. During the 1960s, the great Japanese post-war boom, the Japanese economy was absolutely on fire. They had 17% nominal GDP growth average in that decade. Japanese yen was linked to gold. The official CPI in Japan was about 6% a year. They didn't care. Like, yeah, we're getting rich. Who cares? Same thing happened in Hong Kong in the early 90s. Hong Kong dollar had been linked to the US dollar for about a decade. That was their policy. Inflation in the US was, 3-4%. Inflation in Hong Kong was 10%, but it wasn't a monetary thing. They were just getting rich really fast. And it didn't matter. What if they had given up their super successful US dollar currency board in Hong Kong in the early 90s, making themselves super rich? GDP growth was at 15% a year in those days. And they said, "Oh, no. We want to have a 2% GDP target. 2% inflation target." I don't know even how they would do that. They have to, drop a bomb on the economy to get their growth from 15% down to 3% or something. So once you have that stable value ideal and then practical policy, the CPI is just
It's a
statistical curiosity.
Yeah, and prices. One of the when the people say stable prices, you're assuming there's a real price index. That's not the goal. The goal is to have a stable measure. And if people want to buy a lot of sneakers, posturing as shoes for $2,000, go ahead. You'd see shoe inflation. Take soul, but nobody cares. And a hotel room in Cambodia is going to go for a lot less than a hotel room in Singapore or Hong Kong, but that's not inflation. That's both quality, which these indices have a hard time measuring, and demand and the higher standard of living. Somebody who cut hair in a country that is poor might get $1 a haircut. In this country, you change the name of haircut to something fancy, but you're not going to get anyone to cut hair at $1 a piece. Since the economy is so much more prosperous, they can find opportunities elsewhere. So you're going to have to pay them more to do that kind of service. That's not inflation. That's a reflection of a very prosperous economy. So now they can charge 25. And dentists once thought their business was cavities. Now it's beautifying our mouths, and that's a whole new industry. And you see this constant change all the time.
So I think we have time for one last question. But I said we can ask more in the reception after. So
Yeah.
please feel free to do that.
I guess I get to end on a high note. That's lovely. The fascinating discussion. Thank you, Michael Warlick. I work at Google. China, lots to unpack. Way too much for the time we have. Two examples of recent agitation, and your thoughts on Saudi Arabia agreeing to transact in the yuan, I believe, when they were selling their oil in the early days of the Ukraine invasion. How much of a threat is that to the stability of the US dollar? And then obviously the looming threat to Taiwan and their semiconductor industry. What does that mean to really the global economy at large?
I'll say a few words. There's a lot of idea that, the U.S. losing its reserve currency status could be some disaster. Well, Britain lost its reserve currency status as a leader after World War II, and Britain actually did have a hard time in those days, but it wasn't a catastrophe. We can get by if we manage the dollar well. But I think there's clearly an interest in China and Russia and the BRICS and the global South, whatever you want to call it, for better global leadership. And it was interesting to us sitting here is that when China, the state television channel in China with 1 billion viewers, and they had a state-sponsored documentary on world monetary systems, they came to New York and then they interviewed Steve and me about the gold standard.
And that's the lesson, whether it's China or the Dutch or the Brits. If you get it right, amazing things will happen. And what's amazing is more countries don't consciously do it. And while most currencies try to fix to the euro and to the dollar just for convenience of trade, when their currency does come under attack for whatever reason, what's amazing is why they should buy our book, hint, they don't know how to defend their currency. And one of the great myths is that a central bank, when it goes in the market and buys its currency to shore it up, it doesn't work. It would work if they just stopped there, reducing the supply of their currency because they're buying it up. What these people do is after they buy it up on the foreign exchange market, is then pump the money back into its domestic economy. So its base money doesn't change. All they've done is run down their reserves. Thailand did it in the late 90s when they came under attack for no valid reason. They just pumped out their reserves, trying to hold up the bat. But the foreign exchange dealers realized they didn't know what they were doing because it was like taking a bucket of water, removing it from one end of the pool and then pouring it in the other end. The base money did not change. And so you got to run on the bat, and we had the Asian crisis unnecessarily. So if you ever see a central bank from a country like Turkey, hopefully Erdogan won't shoot the guy, but tell the central banker, when it comes under attack, you don't have to raise interest rates, just reduce your base money. Start reducing your money supply until you get to a level that you think is proper. And if you do that, whether it's like 12 lira to the dollar, I don't know what it is in Turkey now. They always debase their currency, but you fix a measure and then do the base money based on that, you won't have a crisis anymore. But they never learned that lesson. And the IMF, by the way, is the worst thing to go to when you want to cure an economy.
Well, I think that was a high
On
note.
that high note.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. And thank you to our audience who joined us online. I invite everyone here to stay and continue the conversation. The bar will remain open till 8:15. And if you haven't already picked up your copy of Inflation, please do. And on that note, let's thank the speakers one more time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.